The gunshot echoed through the canyon as Grace Miller pressed her back against the cold stone, praying the hoofbeats would fade into the distance. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her trembling fingers clutching the small leather pouch that had cost her husband his life just 3 days ago. The Montana Territory of 1878 was unforgiving to most, but especially to a woman alone. The setting sun painted the rugged landscape in hues of orange and gold, a cruel beauty that offered no comfort as Grace stumbled forward, exhaustion threatening to overcome her. Her once fine dress was torn and mudded, her dark hair falling in tangled waves from what had been a neat bun. The approaching night brought with it a biting cold that cut through her thin coat. In the distance, through the gathering darkness, she spotted a flicker of light, a cabin, its lone window a beacon of hope in the wilderness. With renewed determination, Grace forced her weary legs to carry her toward that promise of shelter, each step a victory against the elements and her own fatigue. The cabin was modest but sturdy, smoke curling from its stone chimney. Grace hesitated at the door, her knuckles poised to knock. What if the occupant was no better than the men pursuing her? But the alternative was a night in the open, and that would surely be her death. Drawing a deep breath, she rapped her knuckles against the wooden door, the sound seeming feeble against the vast silence of the surrounding wilderness. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she heard movement inside, a chair scraping against floorboards, footsteps approaching. The door remained closed. "Who's there?" A man's voice, deep and wary, called from inside. "Please," Grace managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need help." Another pause, then the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened just enough for her to see a sliver of the man's face, illuminated by the lamp he held in one hand. His other hand, she noted, rested near the holster at his hip. "Madam." He questioned, his eyes a startling blue even in the dim light, taking in her bedraggled appearance. "I'm sorry to disturb you," Grace said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I've been traveling for days. I have nowhere else to go." The man hesitated, then opened the door wider, raising the lamp to better see her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. A few days' worth of beard shadowed his jaw, and his dark hair fell in waves to his collar. "You're hurt," he observed, noticing the dried blood on her sleeve from where a bullet had grazed her earlier that day. Grace swayed slightly, exhaustion finally overwhelming her. "Please," she whispered again before darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. The last thing she remembered was the stranger stepping forward, the lamp casting long shadows as he caught her before she hit the ground. Owen Blackwood had come to the Montana Territory to forget to bury himself in hard work and solitude until the memories faded, or he did. For 3 years, he'd kept to himself, speaking to others only when necessary during his infrequent trips to town for supplies. The ranch was small, but it was his, and more importantly, it was far from St. Louis and the ghosts that haunted him there. He hadn't expected to find a half-dead woman on his doorstep, especially not one being hunted. For that much was clear: the fear in her eyes, the wound on her arm, the way she'd collapsed from exhaustion rather than injury told a story he recognized all too well. After carrying her inside, Owen laid her gently on his bed, the only proper one in the cabin. He set the lamp on the bedside table and examined her arm. The wound wasn't deep, just a graze, but it needed cleaning. He moved to the kitchen, putting water on to boil, then returned with a cloth and his limited medical supplies. As he cleaned the wound, the woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Immediately, she tried to sit up, panic evident in her expression. "Easy," Owen said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "You're safe here." She regarded him with wary eyes, hazel, he noticed, flecked with gold in the lamplight. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been at the door. "My ranch, about 20 miles west of Silverbridge." He continued cleaning her wound, careful not to cause more pain than necessary. "I'm Owen Blackwood." She hesitated, clearly debating whether to trust him with her name. "Grace," she finally said. "Grace Miller." "Mrs. Miller," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Are you hungry?" As if in answer, her stomach growled audibly, and a flush of embarrassment colored her cheeks. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. Owen nodded and moved to the fireplace where a pot of stew had been simmering. He ladled a generous portion into a bowl and brought it to her with a chunk of bread he'd baked that morning. It's not fancy, he warned, but it's hot. Grace accepted the food with trembling hands. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Owen, he corrected, returning to his chair by the fire to give her space as she ate. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing eagerness as her body demanded nourishment. When she finished, she placed the empty bowl on the table beside her. Those men, Owen said after a moment. The ones you're running from, will they come looking for you here? Grace's hands tightened in her lap. I don't know, they might. I'm sorry to bring trouble to your door. What do they want? She hesitated, then reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew the small leather pouch he'd noticed earlier. This, or rather, what's inside it? Slowly, she opened the pouch and tipped the contents into her palm. Even in the lamplight, the gold nugget gleamed, roughly the size of a hen's egg. Owen's eyebrows rose. That's a fair bit of trouble to be carrying around. Grace nodded, her expression somber. My husband, Thomas, found it 3 weeks ago. He was so excited. We'd been struggling since we came west. The farm wasn't producing as he'd hoped, and we were nearly out of money. Her voice caught. He thought this would change everything. And instead, it got him killed. She closed her fingers around the nugget. We were in town, and he had too much to drink at the saloon. Started talking about our luck changing, showed the nugget to the wrong people. The men chasing you, she nodded. They came to our farm 2 nights ago. Thomas tried to fight them off. Her voice broke, and she took a moment to compose herself. I managed to grab this and run. They've been after me ever since. Owen watched her, his face unreadable in the dancing firelight. You should rest, he finally said. We'll figure out what to do in the morning. Grace looked up at him, gratitude and wariness warring in her expression. Why are you helping me? A shadow passed over Owen's features. Let's just say I know what it's like to lose everything. He stood, moving toward a chest in the corner. You take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire. I can't take your bed, you can and you will, he said firmly, but not unkindly. You need proper rest more than I do. Too exhausted to argue, Grace nodded. Owen provided her with one of his clean shirts to sleep in and tactfully stepped outside while she changed. When he returned, she was already beneath the covers, her eyes heavy with approaching sleep. Thank you, she murmured as he extinguished the lamp, leaving only the fire's glow to illuminate the cabin. Owen nodded in acknowledgement, then settled into his makeshift bed near the hearth. Long after Grace's breathing had evened into sleep, he remained awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what twist of fate had brought this woman to his door and why, for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than emptiness in his chest. Morning came with pale light filtering through the cabin's small windows. Grace woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. The smell of coffee and cooking food brought her fully awake, and she sat up to find Owen at the stove, his back to her as he tended to breakfast. Morning, he said without turning, somehow sensing she was awake. There's water in that basin if you want to wash up. Breakfast is nearly ready. Grace slipped from the bed, grateful for the privacy screen Owen had thoughtfully placed near the basin. She washed quickly, doing her best to tame her wild hair with her fingers. Her dress was filthy, but she had no alternative, so she put it back on with a grimace. When she emerged, Owen was placing plates on the table, eggs, bacon, and biscuits that made her mouth water. He glanced up as she approached, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes before he looked away. Sit, he invited, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. You need to get your strength back. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Grace spoke. I should leave today. I've imposed enough, and those men might still be looking for me. Owen took a sip of his coffee. And where would you go? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Grace had no family in the territory, no friends close enough to risk their lives for her. I don't know, she admitted. But I can't stay here and put you in danger. I can handle myself, Owen replied, his tone matter of fact, and those men won't be expecting you to be here. They'll be looking for a woman alone on the trail. He paused, considering. Stay a few days, rest, recover, then we can figure out a plan. Grace studied him, trying to understand this taciturn man who had taken her in without question. Why would you risk yourself for a stranger? Owen's gaze met hers, and for a moment she glimpsed something profound in their blue depths: loss, understanding, and a flicker of something that might have been hope. Maybe I'm tired of being alone, he said simply, then stood to clear the plates, effectively ending the conversation. After breakfast, Owen showed Grace around the small ranch. It was modest but well-maintained: a barn housing 2 horses and a cow, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden, and a small creek running along the property's edge. The cabin itself was set against a backdrop of pine trees with mountains rising in the distance. It's beautiful, Grace said honestly, taking in the view. How long have you been here? 3 years, Owen replied, leaning against the fence that enclosed the vegetable garden. Came west after the war, worked cattle drives for a while, saved enough to buy this place. You built it yourself, he nodded. Took about a year, been adding to it bit by bit. Grace looked at him curiously. You never married? A shadow passed over Owen's face. I was engaged once. Back in St. Louis. He didn't elaborate and Grace didn't press. They both had their ghosts, it seemed. I need to tend to the animals, Owen said after a moment. You should stay inside just in case. Grace nodded, understanding the precaution. I could help with some chores inside. It's the least I can do. Owen seemed about to refuse, then reconsidered. If you're feeling up to it, I wouldn't say no to someone tidying up a bit. Bachelor living shows, I'm afraid. Despite his self-deprecating words, the cabin was remarkably neat for a man living alone, but Grace welcomed the opportunity to be useful. While Owen worked outside, she swept the floors, organized his modest kitchen, and even found the materials to mend a torn shirt she discovered in a basket of laundry. By midday, they shared another meal, this time with Grace contributing a batch of cornbread made from supplies she found in Owen's pantry. The simple domesticity felt strange to both of them, Owen unused to sharing his space, Grace still raw from the loss of her husband and home. This is good, Owen said, taking a second piece of cornbread. Been a while since I had home cooking. Grace smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her tired face. It's nice to cook for someone again. They fell into a routine over the next few days. Owen would work the ranch while Grace kept the cabin in order and prepared meals. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence. Grace learned that Owen had fought for the Union during the Civil War, that he'd grown up on a farm in Illinois, and that he could read and write better than most men she'd known. Owen, in turn, discovered that Grace had come west with Thomas 4 years ago, full of dreams about building a life in the new territory. She was the daughter of a schoolteacher and could quote Shakespeare as easily as she could bake bread. Her laugh, rare as it was, had a musical quality that made him want to hear it again. Neither spoke of the future or of the men who might still be searching for Grace. It was as if they had created a small, peaceful world within the confines of the ranch, separate from the dangers and complications beyond. But reality intruded on the 4th day when Owen returned from checking his fence line with news. "Riders," he said without preamble as he entered the cabin. 3 of them asking questions at the Peterson place about 10 miles east. Grace's face paled. "Did they describe me?" Owen nodded grimly. "Dark-haired woman traveling alone, said she's wanted for theft." "Theft?" Grace's hands clenched into fists. "They murdered Thomas for that gold and they dare claim I stole it." "Men like that create their own truth," Owen said, checking his rifle before placing it near the door. "Peterson didn't tell them anything, said he hadn't seen anyone matching your description. But they're working their way through the area, farm by farm." Grace stood, her decision made. "I need to leave now before they reach here." "And go where?" Owen challenged, his voice sharper than he intended. "They'll find you, Grace. You can't outrun 3 men on horseback." "I can't stay here and put you in danger." "I'm already in danger," Owen countered. "If they find out I've been harboring you, I'm as good as guilty in their eyes." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "We need a better plan than you just running off alone." Grace sank back into her chair, despair threatening to overwhelm her. What then? What can we possibly do? Owen was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. There's a town about 60 miles north of here. Rivercross, it's bigger than Silverbridge, has a proper sheriff's office. If we could get there, tell your story to the law. Do you think they'd believe me over them? I have no proof of what happened except my word. You have the gold, Owen pointed out, and if these men are as bad as they seem, chances are they're known to the law in one territory or another. Hope flickered in Grace's eyes, then died. Even if that's true, how would we get there? They're watching the trails. Owen's mouth set in a determined line. Not all the trails. There's an old hunting path through the mountains, difficult terrain but passable if you know the way. I've used it a few times. Most folks don't even know it exists. You'd take me there? Grace asked, surprise evident in her voice. I'll do better than that, Owen said, meeting her gaze steadily. I'll go with you. The decision was made quickly after that. They would leave at dawn, taking Owen's 2 horses and only what they could carry. The journey would take 3 days, perhaps 4 if the weather turned. Owen spent the rest of the day preparing packing supplies, checking the horses' shoes, plotting their route on a crude map he'd drawn himself. Grace watched him work, a mixture of gratitude and guilt weighing on her. This man owed her nothing, yet he was risking everything to help her. She thought of Thomas, of the life they'd planned together, now forever beyond reach. And then, unbidden, came thoughts of Owen, his quiet strength, his unexpected kindness, the way his rare smile transformed his solemn face. She pushed such thoughts away. It was too soon, too impossible, too complicated. Yet they persisted as she helped pack food for the journey, as she mended a tear in Owen's spare coat, as she sat across from him at what might be their last dinner in the safety of his cabin. Tell me about her, Grace said suddenly, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Your fiancée in St. Louis. Owen looked up, surprise and something like pain flashing across his features. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Her name was Elizabeth, he finally said, his voice low. We grew up together, planned to marry after the war. He stared into the fire, lost in memory. When I came back, she was engaged to someone else, said she couldn't wait forever, couldn't love a man who'd seen and done the things I had. I'm sorry, Grace said softly. Owen shrugged, a gesture meant to appear casual but failed to hide the old hurt. It was for the best. I wasn't the same man who left for war. She wouldn't have been happy with who I became. And who is that? Grace asked. The man you became. Owen's blue eyes met hers across the table. Someone who needed to start over. Someone who thought being alone was safer than risking loss again. His expression softened slightly, until a desperate widow knocked at my door. The words hung between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Grace's heart beat faster as she held his gaze, seeing in it a reflection of her own confusion, her own unexpected feelings. We should get some sleep, Owen said, breaking the moment. Dawn comes early. That night, despite Owen's insistence that she take the bed again, Grace made her pallet by the fire, leaving Owen the comfort of his own mattress for what might be the last time for days. Sleep eluded her as she stared at the ceiling, listening to Owen's steady breathing from across the room, wondering what the coming days would bring and what would happen afterward if they survived. Dawn broke cold and clear. The sky streaked with pink and gold as Owen and Grace prepared to depart. They worked in efficient silence, loading the horses with their supplies, checking and double-checking that nothing essential was forgotten. Ready? Owen asked as he helped Grace mount the more docile of his 2 horses, a sturdy brown mare named Penny. Grace nodded, adjusting her borrowed coat, one of Owen's, much too large but warm around her shoulders. As I'll ever be. Owen swung up onto his own horse, a tall black gelding called Shadow, and with a last look at the cabin that had been his solitary home for 3 years, led the way toward the pine forest and the hidden trail beyond. They rode in silence for the first hour, climbing steadily higher into the foothills of the mountains. The trail, as Owen had warned, was rough, little more than a game path in places, requiring them to dismount and lead the horses through particularly difficult stretches. By midday, they had climbed high enough that Grace could look back and see the valley spread out below them, Owen's cabin a tiny speck in the distance. The vastness of the landscape was both beautiful and intimidating, a reminder of how small and vulnerable they were. "We'll stop here for a bit," Owen said, helping Grace dismount in a small clearing beside a stream. "Let the horses drink and rest." They shared a simple meal of jerky, dried fruit, and hard biscuits, sitting side by side on a fallen log. The exertion and mountain air had brought color to Grace's cheeks, and despite the circumstances, Owen found himself thinking she had never looked more beautiful. "How did you find this trail?" Grace asked, breaking into his thoughts. "Tracked a wounded elk up here my first winter," Owen replied. "Nearly got lost trying to find my way back. Spent the next spring exploring, mapping it out." He took a drink from his canteen, figured it might be useful someday. "You're a man who plans for contingencies," Grace observed, Owen's mouth quirked in a half smile. "War teaches you that." "So does losing everything," Grace's expression sobered. "I keep thinking about what I'll do if we make it to Rivercross. If the sheriff believes me, I have nowhere to go, no one waiting for me." "You have the gold," Owen reminded her. "That's enough to start over somewhere." "Yes, but where?" "And doing what?" She shook her head. "I don't even know who I am without Thomas, without the farm." Owen was quiet for a moment, then said, "Maybe that's the opportunity, to find out who you are, who you want to be." Grace looked at him thoughtfully. "Is that what you did, coming out here alone?" "Tried to," Owen admitted. "Not sure I found the answer yet." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits, of shared understanding that went beyond words. The moment was broken by the distant sound of a branch snapping. Owen was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the pistol at his hip. "Get behind me," he murmured, eyes scanning the forest around them. Grace complied, her heart racing as Owen slowly drew his weapon. For several tense seconds, they stood frozen, listening. Then from the underbrush emerged a young deer, its large eyes regarding them warily before it bounded away into the trees. Owen released a breath, holstering his pistol. "Just wildlife, but we should move on. We've lingered too long." They continued their journey, the trail growing steeper and more challenging as they ascended further into the mountains. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered, and a chill wind picked up, bringing the promise of rain. "There's a small cave about a mile ahead," Owen said, eyeing the darkening sky. "We can shelter there for the night." They reached the cave just as the first heavy drops began to fall. It was more of an overhang than a true cave, but it offered protection from the elements and a flat area large enough for them to make camp. Owen quickly gathered firewood while Grace unsaddled the horses and secured them under a nearby stand of trees that offered some shelter. By the time full darkness fell, they had a small fire going, its warmth a welcome respite against the increasingly cold night air. The rain had settled into a steady downpour, creating a curtain of water at the cave's entrance. "Storm might slow us down tomorrow," Owen observed as they huddled near the fire, sharing the last of the coffee he'd brought. Grace nodded, pulling his coat tighter around her shoulders. Despite the fire, she was shivering, her dress and boots still damp from their journey. "You're cold," Owen said, concern evident in his voice. Without hesitation, he moved closer, wrapping an arm around her shoulders to share his warmth. Grace tensed momentarily, then relaxed against him, too cold and too tired to maintain proper distance. "Thank you," she murmured. They sat like that for some time, watching the fire, listening to the rain. Grace found herself increasingly aware of Owen's proximity, the solid strength of his chest against her shoulder, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the faint scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to him. "I keep thinking about what you said," she found herself saying, her voice soft in the quiet cave, "about finding out who I want to be." Owen's arm tightened slightly around her shoulders, an unconscious gesture of support, and, "I'm not sure yet, but I think." She hesitated, gathering her courage. "I think I want to be someone brave, someone who doesn't just survive, but lives." She turned slightly to look up at him. "Does that make sense?" In the firelight, Owen's eyes were intensely blue, his expression softening as he met her gaze. "Perfect sense," he said quietly. For a heartbeat, neither moved, caught in a moment of connection that transcended their short acquaintance. Then, with gentle deliberation, Owen leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was brief, tender, a question more than a demand. When he pulled back, uncertainty clouded his features. "I'm sorry," he began. "I shouldn't have." Grace silenced him by placing her fingers against his lips. "Don't apologize," she whispered. "Please." She replaced her fingers with her lips, returning his kiss with one of her own, still gentle, still tentative but unmistakably intentional. When they separated this time, Owen's expression had changed to one of wonder, as if he'd discovered something precious and unexpected. "I don't know what happens next," Grace admitted, her voice barely audible above the rain. "I don't know if it's right to feel this way so soon after Thomas, but I do know that when I'm with you, I feel safe, I feel seen." Owen brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "We don't have to know what happens next," he said. "Not tonight." They slept side by side that night, sharing blankets and body heat against the mountain chill, Owen's arm protectively around Grace's waist. Nothing more happened between them, but something had shifted. A door opened that neither had expected to find. Morning brought clearing skies and the challenge of continuing their journey. The rain had made the trail treacherous in places, slowing their progress as they picked their way carefully through mud and over slick rocks. By midday, they had reached the highest point of their route, a ridge that offered a spectacular view of the mountains stretching to the horizon. "We'll start descending now," Owen said as they paused to rest the horses. "The trail gets easier once we're past this section." Grace nodded, her gaze fixed on the vast landscape before them. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I never imagined such places existed." Owen looked at her, taking in her wind-tousled hair and bright eyes. "Neither did I," he said, though he wasn't looking at the mountains. Their descent was indeed easier than the climb had been, but still challenging enough to require their full attention. By late afternoon, they had reached a more forested area, the trees providing welcome shade against the now hot sun. They made camp that night in a small clearing beside a mountain stream, the sound of running water a soothing backdrop to their evening meal. The tension and uncertainty of the previous night had given way to a quiet understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement of feelings neither was quite ready to name. As they sat beside their campfire, Owen pulled out a small, worn book from his saddlebag, a collection of poetry that had been his companion through the war and beyond. "Would you read something?" Grace asked, surprised and pleased by this unexpected side of him. Owen hesitated, then nodded, opening the book to a dog-eared page. In a voice low and rich, he read a poem about resilience, about finding beauty in broken things, about love that comes unexpectedly. When he finished, Grace's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "That was beautiful," she said. "I wouldn't have taken you for a poetry lover." A slight smile touched Owen's lips. "There's a lot about me you don't know yet," he said, the yet hanging between them like a promise. They retired early that night, both tired from the day's journey. This time, when Owen laid his bedroll next to Grace's, there was no hesitation when he took her in his arms, no uncertainty when their lips met in a kiss deeper and more urgent than before. "Grace," he murmured against her mouth, her name a question and a plea. "Yes," she answered, her hands finding their way into his hair, drawing him closer. Under the vast canopy of stars, they discovered each other slowly, reverently, their coming together both an ending and a beginning, the closing of chapters marked by loss and solitude, the opening of something new and unexpected and full of hope. Afterward, as Grace lay cradled against Owen's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she felt a peace she hadn't known in months, perhaps years. There was still danger ahead, still uncertainty about what awaited them in Rivercross, but in this moment, in his arms, she felt strangely, wonderfully alive. "What are you thinking?" Owen asked softly, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. Grace smiled in the darkness. "That life has a strange way of leading us where we need to go, even when it seems cruel at the time." Owen's arms tightened around her. "I never thought I'd thank God for bringing a desperate, half-starved woman to my door," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I do. Every day since you came, I do." They fell asleep entwined, the fire dying to embers beside them, the future uncertain but facing it together. The third day of their journey brought them down from the mountains and into rolling foothills that would eventually give way to the valley where Rivercross lay. The trail widened in places, becoming more like a proper path, though still far from the main roads that travelers typically used. "We should reach Rivercross by tomorrow afternoon," Owen said as they stopped to water the horses at a small pond. "Assuming we don't run into any trouble." Grace nodded, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "And then," Owen looked at her thoughtfully, "and then we find the sheriff, tell him your story, hope he believes us. And if he doesn't, then we figure something else out," Owen said simply. "Together." The word hung between them, weighted with possibility. Grace smiled, reaching out to take his hand. "Together," she echoed. They rode on, the terrain growing more hospitable as they descended. By late afternoon, they began to see signs of human habitation, a distant farm, smoke rising from a chimney, a fence line cutting across the landscape. "We should be careful now," Owen warned. "We're getting closer to traveled routes. Your pursuers could be anywhere." They proceeded with increased caution, Owen constantly scanning their surroundings, one hand never far from his weapon. As dusk approached, they found a secluded spot among a stand of cottonwood trees to make camp, deliberately avoiding the more obvious camping locations that other travelers might choose. "No fire tonight," Owen decided as they unsaddled the horses. "Can't risk the smoke being seen." They ate a cold supper of the last of their provisions, sitting close together for warmth as the night air grew chill. Despite the progress they'd made, tension had crept back into their interactions, the reality of their situation reasserting itself as they drew closer to civilization. "Tell me about your ranch," Grace said suddenly, breaking the uneasy silence. "What you've built there, what you hope it will become." Owen seemed surprised by the question, but answered thoughtfully, "It's not much now, but I've been adding to it bit by bit. Another field cleared each season, a few more cattle when I can afford them." He paused, looking into the gathering darkness. "I always thought I'd expand the cabin someday, add another room, maybe a proper porch. For a family?" Grace asked softly. Owen's gaze returned to her, his expression vulnerable in a way she'd rarely seen. "I stopped thinking about that possibility a long time ago," he admitted. "Until recently," Grace leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I like imagining it," she said. "Your ranch growing and thriving, children running in the yard." She hesitated, then added quietly, "Us growing old together on that porch you'd build." Owen's arm tightened around her. "Is that what you want, after all this is over?" "I think it is," Grace whispered, the admission both frightening and liberating. "If you want it too." Owen turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. "Grace Miller," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "when I lit that lamp and saw you at my door, something woke up inside me that I thought had died years ago. Every day since then, it's grown stronger." He took a deep breath. "I love you. I know it's fast, I know it's complicated, but I love you, and if you'll have me, I want to build that life with you." Tears sprang to Grace's eyes, happiness welling up so intensely it almost hurt. "I love you too," she said, her voice breaking. "So much it terrifies me." Owen kissed her then, pouring all his hope and longing and newfound purpose into the connection. Grace responded in kind, her arms winding around his neck, anchoring herself to this man who had become her safe harbor in a storm of uncertainty. They slept tangled together beneath the stars, dreams of a shared future mingling with the lingering awareness of the dangers that still lay ahead. Dawn came with a heavy mist clinging to the ground, reducing visibility and lending an ethereal quality to the landscape. They broke camp quickly, eager to reach Rivercross and finally end the threat hanging over them. As they rode, the land continued to open up, forests giving way to scattered farms and eventually to more populated areas. By mid-morning, they could see in the distance the outline of Rivercross, larger than Silverbridge, with proper streets and buildings of varying sizes clustered around what appeared to be a town square. "We'll approach from the north," Owen decided, studying the town from their vantage point on a small rise. Less conspicuous that way, head straight for the sheriff's office. Grace nodded, her stomach tight with nerves. After days in the wilderness with only Owen for company, the prospect of town with its noise and people and potential dangers was daunting. They rode cautiously, joining a well-traveled road that led toward town. Other travelers passed them, a farmer with a wagon of produce, a family in a buckboard, a pair of cowboys heading in the opposite direction. No one paid them much attention, taking them for just another couple traveling to town on business. As they reached the outskirts of River Cross, Owen guided them through quieter side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfare where they might be more easily spotted. The sheriff's office, he knew from previous visits, was just off the town square, a sturdy building with a small jail attached. They were just turning onto the street that would lead them there when Grace's hand suddenly gripped Owen's arm. "Owen," she whispered, her face pale. "The saloon, the man standing outside, that's one of them, the one who shot Thomas." Owen followed her gaze to a man leaning against the hitching post outside the Frontier Saloon. He was tall and lean, with a shock of red hair and a scar that bisected his left eyebrow. His posture was casual, but his eyes were alert, scanning the street as if looking for someone. "Keep your head down," Owen murmured, subtly shifting his position to block Grace from view. "We'll take the alley behind the mercantile. It leads to the back of the sheriff's office." They turned their horses, moving unhurriedly so as not to attract attention. Owen's heart pounded in his chest, acutely aware of how close they were to both safety and danger. If they could just reach the sheriff without being spotted. The alley was narrow and shadowed, empty except for a few crates stacked outside the back door of the mercantile. They dismounted, tying their horses to a post hidden from the main street. "Stay close," Owen instructed, drawing his pistol but keeping it partially concealed beneath his coat. "The sheriff's office is just through there." They moved quietly along the alley, reaching a small yard behind a row of buildings. The back door of the sheriff's office was just ahead, a plain wooden entrance with a small window set at eye level. They were halfway across the yard when a voice called out, freezing them in their tracks. "Well now, what have we here?" Owen whirled, pushing Grace behind him as he raised his weapon. At the entrance to the alley stood two men, one the red-haired man Grace had identified, the other shorter but broader, with a face like weathered leather and cold, assessing eyes. "Seems like we've been looking for you, Mrs. Miller," the second man said, his voice deceptively pleasant. "Been quite the chase." "Stay back," Owen warned, his gun aimed steadily at the red-haired man, who he judged to be the faster draw of the two. "Now, friend," the leather-faced man said, taking a step forward, his hand hovering near his holster. "This isn't your fight. The woman stole something that belongs to us. We're just here to retrieve it." "Liar." Grace's voice rang out, stepping to Owen's side despite his attempt to keep her behind him. "You murdered my husband for that gold. It was never yours." The man's expression hardened. "Your husband should have minded his own business. Now I'm going to be generous and give you one chance to hand over that nugget and walk away." His eyes flicked to Owen. "Both of you." Owen's finger tightened on the trigger. "Not happening," he said coldly. "The only place Grace is going is into that sheriff's office to tell him exactly what you did." A tense silence followed, broken only by the distant sounds of the town going about its business, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding in the small yard. The red-haired man moved first, his hand darting for his gun with practiced speed. Owen fired a split second before him, his bullet catching the man in the shoulder, spinning him around with the impact. The second man drew and fired in almost the same moment, his bullet grazing Owen's side, tearing through his coat and leaving a burning trail across his ribs. Owen staggered but stayed upright, returning fire as Grace screamed. The leather-faced man jerked as Owen's bullet struck him in the chest, a look of surprise crossing his features before he crumpled to the ground. The red-haired man, wounded but still dangerous, raised his gun again, aiming not at Owen but at Grace. Owen lunged, tackling Grace to the ground as the shot rang out, the bullet passing through the space where she had been standing. Before the man could fire again, the back door of the sheriff's office burst open and a tall figure in a badge stepped out, shotgun raised. "Drop it." The sheriff commanded, his weapon trained on the red-haired man. "Drop it now or I'll blow you in half." For a moment, it seemed the man might try to shoot anyway. Then, with a curse, he let his gun fall to the dirt. "On your knees, hands behind your head," the sheriff ordered, moving forward cautiously. Once the man had complied, the sheriff glanced at Owen and Grace, still on the ground. "You folks all right?" Owen sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in his side. "I'm hit, but it's not bad. She's unharmed." Grace was already examining his wound, her hands trembling but determined. "It's just a graze," she confirmed, relief evident in her voice. "But it needs cleaning." The sheriff, after securing the red-haired man's wrists with handcuffs, approached them. "Name's Sheriff Daniel Hayward," he introduced himself. "Want to tell me what this is all about?" Grace looked up, meeting the sheriff's questioning gaze. "My name is Grace Miller. These men murdered my husband for a gold nugget he found on our property. They've been hunting me ever since." Sheriff Hayward's eyebrows rose, but he nodded thoughtfully. "And you?" he asked, looking at Owen. "Owen Blackwood. I found Mrs. Miller at my door 4 days ago, half dead from exhaustion. We came here hoping to find justice." The sheriff helped Owen to his feet, then extended a hand to Grace. "Well, you found it," he said grimly, glancing at the body of the leather-faced man. "Though not quite the way I'd prefer," he sighed. "Let's get you both inside. I've got questions, and you," he nodded to Owen, "need that wound tended to." In the sheriff's office, as a doctor was summoned to treat Owen's injury, Grace recounted the full story: Thomas's discovery of the gold, his loose talk in the saloon, the attack on their farm, her desperate flight, and Owen's intervention. "The nugget's right here," she concluded, producing the leather pouch from her pocket. "It was found on our land. It rightfully belongs to me now." Sheriff Hayward examined the gold, then handed it back to Grace. "I believe you, Mrs. Miller." "These men," he nodded toward the cells where the red-haired man now sat, glaring sullenly, "are known troublemakers. Jed Harmon and his gang have been suspected in several robberies and at least one other murder in the territory." "There were 3 of them," Grace said, suddenly remembering. "Where's the third?" "If you mean Silas Tucker, he won't be bothering anyone anymore," the sheriff replied. "Shot it out with a posse over in Dakota Territory last month, died on the spot." Relief washed over Grace. It was over. The nightmare that had begun with Thomas's murder was finally ending. The doctor arrived and tended to Owen's wound, confirming that it was indeed just a graze, painful but not serious. He cleaned and bandaged it efficiently, leaving Owen with instructions to keep it clean and avoid strenuous activity for a few days. "You folks got a place to stay in town?" Sheriff Hayward asked as the doctor packed up his supplies. Owen and Grace exchanged a look. "No," Owen admitted. "We came straight here." The sheriff nodded. "The Riverview Hotel is decent, clean at least. I'd suggest you rest up there for a day or 2. I'll need statements from both of you for the circuit judge when he comes through next week." "And after that?" Grace asked. "We're free to go." "After that, you're free to go wherever you please, Mrs. Miller. The gold is yours by right." The sheriff hesitated, then added more gently, "I'm sorry about your husband. This won't bring him back, but at least his killers will face justice." Grace nodded, tears welling unexpectedly. Thomas had been gone less than a week, yet it felt like a lifetime ago. So much had changed, including her. They took rooms at the Riverview Hotel as suggested adjoining rooms. Though they both knew Owen would spend the night in Grace's bed, regulations and propriety be damned. After the events of the day, neither wanted to be separated, even by a wall. As evening fell, they sat together on the small balcony outside Grace's room, watching the town settle into night. Owen's arm was around Grace's shoulders, her head resting against him in what had already become a familiar, comfortable position. "What happens now?" Grace asked softly, echoing her question from earlier but with a different meaning now. Owen was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently stroking her arm. "That depends on you," he finally said. "You have choices now. The gold gives you freedom to go anywhere, do anything." Grace lifted her head to look at him, seeing the vulnerability beneath his steady exterior. "I meant what I said last night," she told him, "about wanting a life with you if you still want that too," the tension visibly drained from Owen's shoulders. "I do," he said simply, "more than anything." "Then that's what happens next," Grace said, a smile spreading across her face. "We go home to your ranch, our ranch." She touched his cheek gently. "We build that porch you talked about. We add rooms to the cabin as we need them. We grow old together, watching the seasons change from rocking chairs we'll place side by side." Owen turned his face to kiss her palm, his eyes never leaving hers. "Sounds like heaven," he murmured. "It won't be perfect," Grace cautioned. "I burn biscuits sometimes, and I've been told I snore." Owen laughed, the sound rich and warm in the quiet evening. "I leave my boots in the middle of the floor, and I'm terrible at remembering important dates. See, already finding each other's flaws," Grace teased, leaning in to press a soft kiss to his lips. "But I love you anyway, Owen Blackwood." Boots in the middle of the floor and all. "And I love you, Grace Miller." Snoring and burnt biscuits included. They sealed the promise with another kiss, deeper and filled with the certainty of a future neither had dared hope for just days ago. The circuit judge arrived in Rivercross the following week as expected. The trial of Jed Harmon was brief but thorough, with Grace providing testimony about the night Thomas was killed and the subsequent pursuit. Owen testified about finding Grace and their journey to Rivercross, including the confrontation that had ended with Harmon's capture and his partner's death. Harmon was found guilty of murder and attempted murder, sentenced to hang for his crimes. Grace attended the sentencing, needing to see justice served for Thomas, but she did not stay for the execution. Some chapters needed to be closed, but she didn't need to witness every page. With the trial concluded and their statements given, Owen and Grace were finally free to leave Rivercross. The gold nugget, now legally established as Grace's property, had been sold to a bank in town for a sum that would secure their future comfortably. They left town on a bright morning in early summer, their horses well rested and their spirits high. The journey back to Owen's ranch, their ranch now, would take several days, but neither was in a hurry. The danger was past, and the road ahead belonged to them alone. They traveled at an easy pace, enjoying each other's company and the simple pleasure of being alive and together. At night, they would make camp and lie beneath the stars, planning their future in quiet conversations that often led to more intimate expressions of their love. On the fourth day of their journey, as they crested a hill that offered the first view of the valley where Owen's cabin stood, he reined in his horse and waited for Grace to draw alongside him. "There it is," he said, gesturing to the small ranch nestled against the backdrop of pine trees. "Home." Grace followed his gaze, seeing not just the cabin and outbuildings as they currently existed, but the vision they had created together: the expanded house, the larger barn, the fields that would feed their family, the yard where children would play. "It's perfect," she said, reaching over to take his hand. Owen looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a contentment that had been absent when she first met him. "Not yet," he said, "but it will be." They rode down the hill together. Toward the future they would build side by side, a future neither had imagined possible when a desperate widow knocked at his door. A cowboy lit the lamp, and in doing so, found his missing heart. When they reached the cabin, Owen dismounted first, then helped Grace down from her horse. Before she could move toward the door, he swept her into his arms, mindful of his healing wound but determined to do this properly. "What are you doing?" Grace laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Carrying my future wife over the threshold," Owen replied with a smile. "It's tradition, isn't it? We're not married yet," Grace pointed out, though she made no effort to be put down. Owen's expression grew serious. "We will be as soon as possible if you'll have me." Grace's eyes softened. "I will, of course I will." With that promise between them, Owen carried her into the cabin that would be their home, the place where their story had begun and where many new chapters waited to be written. The weeks that followed were filled with work and planning as they settled into their life together. Grace brought a warmth and vitality to the cabin that transformed it from a mere shelter to a true home. Owen found himself singing again, something he hadn't done since before the war, as he worked the land that now had new purpose and meaning. They were married in late summer, a simple ceremony performed by the preacher from Silverbridge, with only a few neighbors as witnesses. Grace wore a new dress of pale blue, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Owen, in a clean shirt and his best trousers, looked at her as if she were the only person in the world as they spoke their vows beneath the old oak tree near the creek. That night, as husband and wife, they lay in the bed they now officially shared, planning the changes they would make to the cabin before winter set in. "I think we should start with the porch," Owen said, his fingers tracing idle patterns on Grace's bare shoulder. "Build it wide enough for those 2 rocking chairs you mentioned," Grace smiled, nestling closer to him. "And then another bedroom," she suggested, "for when we need it." Owen's hand stilled, then moved to rest gently on her stomach. "Are you saying—" Grace placed her hand over his. "Not yet," she assured him, "but someday, hopefully not too far in the future." Owen kissed her tenderly. "Whenever it happens, I'll be ready, we'll be ready." Fall came with its riot of colors and the first hints of the winter to come. True to his word, Owen built the porch wide and sturdy, with 2 rocking chairs placed side by side as Grace had envisioned. Together, they added a second bedroom to the cabin, working side by side through the shortening days to finish before the first snows. As winter settled over the land, bringing with it long evenings by the fire and mornings waking in each other's arms, Grace discovered that she was indeed with child. The news filled Owen with a joy he had never known, his hands gentle and reverent when they rested on the slight swell of her belly. "A spring baby," he said wonderingly, "new life with the new season." Grace covered his hands with hers. "A fresh start for all of us." The winter passed in a cocoon of contentment, the isolation that had once been Owen's refuge now a shared joy as they prepared for the child that would join their family. Grace sewed tiny garments by the fire while Owen crafted a cradle from pine wood, both of them imagining the life that would soon fill their home with new sounds and experiences. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and coaxing new growth from the earth, Grace's time came. The midwife from Silverbridge attended her, with Owen pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door until the first cry of his daughter reached his ears. He entered the room with tears streaming unashamedly down his face to find Grace, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in the softest blanket they owned. "Come meet your daughter," Grace said softly, her eyes filled with love as she looked from the baby to her husband. Owen approached the bed reverently, sitting beside Grace and gazing in wonder at the perfect, tiny face of their child. "She's beautiful," he whispered, "like her mother." "I thought we might call her Hope," Grace suggested, "because that's what she represents for us, what we found together." Owen nodded, too overcome with emotion to speak for a moment. Then, clearing his throat, he said, "Hope Blackwood, perfect for our daughter." As spring gave way to summer, and summer to fall, their life settled into a rhythm centered around their growing child. Hope thrived, a happy baby with her father's blue eyes and her mother's dark hair, bringing joy to every day with her discoveries and milestones. The ranch prospered as well, with the money from the gold nugget allowing for improvements that would have taken years otherwise. A larger barn was built, more cattle acquired, fields expanded and fenced. What had once been a lonely bachelor's holding was transforming into a true family ranch with room to grow and flourish. On cool evenings, when the day's work was done and Hope was asleep in her cradle, Owen and Grace would sit in their rocking chairs on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. Sometimes they would talk of the future, of the brothers and sisters they hoped Hope would have, of the legacy they were building together. Other times they would sit in companionable silence, content in each other's presence and the life they had created. "You ever think about how we met?" Grace asked one such evening as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "How close I came to not finding your cabin that night." Owen reached over to take her hand, his thumb tracing the simple gold band he had placed on her finger. "I think about it often," he admitted. How many things had to happen good and bad to bring us to that moment? He looked at her, his expression serious. I wouldn't wish the pain you went through on anyone, but I can't help being grateful that it led you to my door. Grace squeezed his hand. I believe Thomas would be happy for us, she said softly. He always wanted me to be safe and loved, and I am with you. Owen brought her hand to his lips. Always, he promised, for as long as I live. As they sat together in the gathering dusk, the light from the cabin's window spilled out onto the porch, the same lamp that Owen had lit on that fateful night when a desperate widow knocked at his door and a lonely cowboy found his missing heart. Now it illuminated a different scene. A family, a home, a love that had grown from the most unexpected of beginnings into something enduring and true. Inside, hope stirred in her cradle, her small sounds carrying through the open window. Grace and Owen exchanged a smile, then rose together to go to their daughter, moving as one into the warmth of the home they had built not just of wood and stone, but of love and hope and the promise of days to come. In the years that followed, the Blackwood Ranch grew and prospered, as did the family that called it home. Hope was joined by 2 brothers and a sister, filling the expanded cabin with laughter and occasional chaos that Owen and Grace wouldn't have traded for all the gold in Montana. The wilderness that had once seemed so imposing to Grace became as familiar and beloved as the curves of Owen's face. She learned its seasons and moods, its dangers and its beauty, finding in its vastness not isolation but freedom. Owen, who had sought solitude in these same mountains, discovered that sharing them with Grace and their children brought a depth of joy he had never imagined possible. They faced challenges, of course harsh winters that tested their preparations, dry summers that threatened the crops, the normal trials of raising 4 spirited children in a remote location. But they faced each obstacle together, their partnership strengthened by the knowledge that they had already overcome far greater odds to find each other. On the 20th anniversary of the day Grace had appeared at Owen's door, they sat once again in their rocking chairs on the porch, watching their youngest child playing with a puppy in the yard while the older children helped with evening chores. Would you change anything? Owen asked, his hair now threaded with silver, but his blue eyes as bright as ever when they looked at his wife. If you could go back to that night, knowing everything that would happen, Grace considered the question, her gaze taking in the home and family they had built together. The pain of those early days had faded, leaving only the occasional bittersweet memory of Thomas and the life that might have been. In its place was the rich tapestry of the life she and Owen had woven together thread by thread, day by day, choice by choice. Not a single thing, she answered truthfully, reaching for his hand still strong, still fitting perfectly with hers after all these years. Every step led me here to you, to us. I wouldn't change a moment of it. Owen lifted their joined hands to his lips, a gesture unchanged by the passing decades. Nor would I, he said, not one moment since I lit that lamp and found you at my door. As the sun set behind the mountains they both loved, casting long shadows across the land that had sustained them, Owen and Grace Blackwood remained side by side. Their love as enduring as the wilderness around them, a testament to the healing power of second chances and the unexpected ways in which broken hearts find their way home.